The fire started in the east wing just after midnight. It was March 17, 1903, and the servants' quarters on the third floor of Ironcrest Hall filled with smoke so thick that the night staff could barely see the stairwell. They stumbled through the darkness, their lungs burning, their hands groping along wall-papered corridors that had once smelled of polish and roses, but now reeked of char and fear. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived from the town of Allegheny, 3 miles down the valley, the flames had already consumed 2 bedrooms, a linen closet, and part of the servants' dining hall. No one died that night, but something darker than ash settled into the bones of the house. That fire was the first. Ironcrest Hall stands today on a hillside overlooking the Monongahela River in western Pennsylvania, a towering monument to America's Gilded Age, built in 1889 by steel magnate Cornelius Ashford Whitmore. The mansion sprawls across 42 rooms, with turrets that pierce the sky, stained glass windows imported from France, and a grand staircase carved from Italian marble. Tourists visit it now, guided through roped-off parlors and reconstructed bedrooms, marveling at the opulence, the craftsmanship, the sheer audacity of wealth. But beneath the polished surface lies a story the brochures never tell, a story of 3 fires, missing servants, whispered accusations, and a family that vanished in the dead of night, leaving behind a mansion haunted not by ghosts, but by guilt. This is the dark story of Ironcrest Hall, a mansion shaped by fear and fortune, where power ended and darkness began. But before you hear this story, make sure to subscribe to Empire Manners for more deep investigations into America's most mysterious estates. Hit that subscribe button now, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the Gilded Age forever. To understand Ironcrest Hall, you must first understand the man who built it. Cornelius Ashford Whitmore was born in 1841 in a small farming village outside Pittsburgh, the son of a blacksmith and a school teacher. He grew up in a 2-room cabin with dirt floors, where winter winds slipped through cracks in the walls, and dinner often consisted of nothing more than cornmeal and lard. But Cornelius was sharp, ambitious, and ruthless in ways that his gentle parents could never have predicted. By the time he was 16, he had left home to work in the iron mills along the Allegheny River, shoveling coal into blast furnaces that roared like living beasts. He slept on the factory floor. He ate stale bread. He saved every penny. At 19, he enlisted in the Union Army and fought in the Civil War, rising to the rank of lieutenant. He saw blood, fire, and the kind of mechanized destruction that would later define his fortune. When the war ended in 1865, Cornelius returned to Pittsburgh with a clarity of purpose. Steel was the future, and he intended to own it. By 1870, he had opened his first foundry, a modest operation with 10 workers and 2 furnaces. By 1880, he had expanded into rail production, forging steel tracks for the rapidly growing railroad industry. By 1885, he was one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania, supplying steel to the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, and half a dozen smaller lines stretching west toward the frontier. His competitors called him the Iron Wolf. His workers called him worse. In 1887, Cornelius married Evelyn Margaret Ashford, the daughter of a Philadelphia banking family. She was 23, he was 46. The wedding was held at the Church of the Redeemer in downtown Pittsburgh, and the reception filled 3 floors of the Duquesne Club. Champagne flowed, orchestras played. The cream of Pittsburgh society danced beneath crystal chandeliers. But Evelyn, in her ivory silk gown with seed pearls sewn by hand, looked like a woman walking to her execution. 2 years later, Cornelius began construction on Ironcrest Hall. The site he chose was a steep hillside overlooking the Monongahela, a place where the river bent like a silver ribbon, and the smoke from the steel mills below rose in dark columns against the sky. He hired an architect from New York, a man named Harrison Blackwell, who had designed mansions for the Vanderbilts and the Astors. Blackwell arrived in Pittsburgh with rolls of blueprints and a team of draftsmen, and for 6 months they worked in a rented office downtown, sketching elevations and floor plans, calculating load-bearing walls and the precise angle of sunlight through stained glass. The design was ambitious. The house would have 42 rooms spread across 3 floors, with a full basement for servants and utilities. There would be a grand entrance hall with a marble staircase, a ballroom with gilded molding, a library with floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves, a conservatory filled with tropical plants, and a smoking room paneled in mahogany. The exterior would be built from limestone quarried in Indiana, with turrets and gables in the Victorian Gothic style. The roof would be slate. The windows would be leaded glass. Every detail, Cornelius insisted, must speak of permanence, of power, of a legacy that would outlast him. Construction began in April of 1889. Cornelius hired a crew of over 200 men, most of them immigrants from Ireland, Poland, and Italy. They worked 6 days a week, from dawn until dusk, hauling limestone blocks, mixing mortar, hammering nails into oak beams. The pay was $1.50 a day, barely enough to feed a family. The work was backbreaking. Men fell from scaffolding. Fingers were crushed by falling stone. A Polish laborer named Joseph Kowalski was killed when a pulley system failed, and a limestone block weighing half a ton dropped on him. His body was carried off the site in a wagon. His widow received $20 and a notice to vacate the company housing within the week. But the house rose. By the summer of 1890, the exterior walls were complete. By autumn, the roof was on. By winter, the interior work had begun. Plasterers and painters and carpenters swarming through the rooms like ants, transforming raw space into opulence. Evelyn visited the site only once. She stood in the unfinished ballroom, her breath fogging in the cold air, and stared at the scaffolding and the dust and the skeleton of what would become her prison. She said nothing. She left before Cornelius could show her the rest. Ironcrest Hall was finished in May of 1891. The cost had been staggering, over $400,000, equivalent to more than $12 million. Today, Cornelius hosted a grand opening party that lasted 3 days. 500 guests attended, arriving in carriages that lined the driveway like a parade. There was a 12-piece orchestra, a feast prepared by chefs brought in from New York, and fireworks that lit up the valley. Newspaper reporters from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia wandered through the rooms, taking notes, marveling at the opulence. The Pittsburgh Gazette called it a palace worthy of a king. The Philadelphia Inquirer described it as a monument to American industry and ingenuity. But in the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor, where the staff slept in narrow rooms with thin mattresses and no heat, there was only silence. The staff at Ironcrest Hall numbered 23. There was a butler, a head housekeeper, 2 ladies' maids, 3 chambermaids, 2 footmen, a cook, 3 kitchen maids, a scullery maid, a laundress, 2 groundskeepers, a coachman, a stable boy, and 3 general laborers. Most of them were young, in their teens or early 20s. Most of them came from families that needed the money desperately, and most of them would come to regret ever setting foot in that house. The butler, a man named Thomas Crane, was 42 years old and had worked in service his entire life. He had come to Ironcrest Hall from a position with a family in Boston, lured by the promise of higher wages and the prestige of working for one of Pennsylvania's wealthiest men. He managed the household with military precision, overseeing the staff, coordinating meals, ensuring that every detail met Cornelius's exacting standards. He slept in a small room off the main kitchen, and he was always the first to wake and the last to go to bed. The head housekeeper was a woman named Margaret Finch, stern and efficient, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a voice that could silence a room. She had been with the Whitmore family since Evelyn's wedding, brought in to train the household staff and maintain order. She kept a ledger of every expense, every broken dish, every missing spoon. She tolerated no laziness, no gossip, no deviation from routine. The younger maids feared her. Among those maids was a girl named Catherine O'Malley, just 16 years old, with red hair and freckles and a quick smile that disappeared the moment she crossed the threshold of Ironcrest Hall. She had been hired as a chambermaid in the spring of 1891, shortly after the house opened. Her job was to clean the bedrooms, make the beds, empty the chamber pots, dust the furniture, and stay invisible. She worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, with a single hour off in the afternoon. She earned $8 a month. She slept in a room barely larger than a closet, sharing it with another maid. At night, she wrote letters to her mother back in Pittsburgh, letters filled with reassurances that everything was fine, that the work was manageable, that the family treated her well. None of it was true. Cornelius Whitmore ruled his household the way he ruled his steel mills, with absolute authority and no tolerance for weakness. He spoke to the servants rarely, and when he did, it was to issue orders or criticize. He expected perfection. A crooked painting, a smudge on a window, a meal served 2 minutes late. These were offenses punishable by docked wages or immediate dismissal. He kept a small notebook in which he recorded infractions, and at the end of each month he reviewed it with Margaret Finch, deciding who would be reprimanded and who would be let go. Evelyn, by contrast, barely seemed to notice the staff at all. She spent most of her days in her private sitting room on the second floor, reading or staring out the window at the river below. She rarely attended social events. She spoke in whispers. The servants said she looked like a ghost, pale and thin, drifting through the house as if she weren't really there. There were rumors that she was ill, that she took laudanum to help her sleep, that she had lost a child before the house was built and had never recovered. No one knew for sure. No one dared to ask. The first fire came on March 17, 1903, 12 years after the house was completed. It started just after midnight in the east wing of the third floor, in the servants' quarters. The alarm was raised by one of the chambermaids, a girl named Alice Porter, who woke to the smell of smoke and ran screaming through the hallways, pounding on doors, pulling her fellow servants from their beds. By the time Thomas Crane reached the third floor, the flames had already consumed 2 bedrooms and were spreading fast, feeding on the old wood and plaster, the cheap furniture, the thin curtains. The servants evacuated quickly, stumbling down the back staircase in their nightclothes, coughing and gasping. Cornelius and Evelyn were awakened by the commotion and ushered out of the house by Thomas Crane himself, who wrapped a blanket around Evelyn's shoulders and guided her down the grand staircase and out onto the front lawn. The volunteer fire brigade arrived half an hour later, pulling their horse-drawn pumps up the long driveway, shouting orders, unspooling hoses. They fought the fire for 3 hours, dousing the flames with water pumped from the river. By the time the sun rose, the fire was out. The damage was extensive. 2 bedrooms were destroyed, their contents reduced to blackened rubble. The servants' dining hall was partially burned. The hallway was charred and waterlogged. The smell of smoke would linger for months. An investigation was launched. The fire chief, a man named William Harding, examined the site carefully, looking for clues. He found the point of origin in one of the bedrooms, a small room that had been occupied by Catherine O'Malley. The bed was burned, the walls blackened, but there was no obvious cause. No overturned lamp, no smoldering embers in the fireplace, just ash and ruin. Chief Harding questioned the staff. Most of them could offer no explanation. Catherine O'Malley, however, was nowhere to be found. She had not been seen since the night of the fire. Her belongings were gone. Her bed, what remained of it, was empty. Thomas Crane told the fire chief that Catherine had been dismissed the previous day for insubordination and had left the property that evening. He had no idea where she had gone. The official report listed the cause of the fire as accidental, likely due to a dropped candle or a careless match. The case was closed. Repairs began. Life at Ironcrest Hall returned to normal, but the servants whispered. They said Catherine had not left willingly. They said she had been crying the day before the fire, that Margaret Finch had caught her stealing food from the kitchen, that Cornelius had threatened to have her arrested. They said she had been afraid, and now she was gone, and no one knew where. And then there were the rumors, darker and more insidious, that began to circulate in the weeks after the fire. Rumors that Catherine had not set the fire at all, that someone else had done it to cover up something worse. Rumors that she had been seen in places she should not have been, that she had caught the attention of someone in the household, someone powerful, someone dangerous. Rumors that she had paid the price for knowing too much. Years later, a letter would surface, written by Catherine O'Malley to her mother and dated 2 days before the fire. In it, she wrote, "Mama, I cannot stay here any longer. Something terrible is happening in this house, and I fear I will not be safe if I speak of it. If you do not hear from me again, know that I tried to be brave, I tried to do what was right, but I am afraid. I am so afraid." The letter was found among her mother's belongings after her death in 1928. By then, Catherine O'Malley had been missing for 25 years. No trace of her was ever found. The second fire came on August 9, 1908, 5 years after the first. This time, it started in the conservatory, a glass-walled room on the ground floor filled with exotic plants and wicker furniture. It was late afternoon, and most of the family and staff were outside, attending a garden party on the south lawn. Evelyn had organized the event, one of the few social occasions she had hosted in years, and nearly 50 guests were present, sipping tea and eating petite fours beneath white canopies. The fire was discovered by one of the footmen, a young man named Henry Doyle, who had gone inside to fetch more ice. He smelled smoke, followed it to the conservatory, and found the room engulfed in flames. He shouted for help, and within minutes, the guests were fleeing the lawn, the staff was scrambling to fight the fire, and chaos had descended once again on Ironcrest Hall. This fire was worse than the first. The conservatory was destroyed completely, the glass walls shattered, the plants incinerated, the wicker furniture reduced to ash. The flames spread to the adjacent sitting room, consuming a priceless Persian rug, 2 antique armchairs, and a portrait of Evelyn that Cornelius had commissioned on their wedding day. By the time the fire brigade arrived, half the ground floor was on fire. It took 4 hours to put it out. The damage was catastrophic. The conservatory was a total loss. The sitting room was gutted. The library, which shared a wall with the sitting room, sustained water and smoke damage that ruined hundreds of books. The cost to repair it all would exceed $50,000. Once again, an investigation was launched. Once again, Fire Chief William Harding examined the scene, and once again, the cause was listed as undetermined. There was no clear point of origin, no obvious source of ignition. Harding noted in his report that the fire seemed to have started in multiple places simultaneously, which suggested either a rapid spread or deliberate arson, but without evidence, he could not conclude the latter. Cornelius was furious. He demanded answers. He questioned the staff relentlessly, accusing them of negligence, of carelessness, of sabotage. He fired 3 servants on suspicion alone, sending them away without references or final wages. The household became a place of suspicion and fear. The remaining staff moved through the halls like shadows, afraid to speak, afraid to be noticed. Evelyn, meanwhile, retreated even further into herself. After the second fire, she rarely left her sitting room. She took her meals alone. She refused visitors. The few people who saw her in those days said she looked haunted, her eyes wide and glassy, her hands trembling. There were whispers that she was losing her mind, that the fires had broken something inside her, that she spent her nights pacing her room and talking to herself. And then there was the matter of the footman, Henry Doyle, the young man who had discovered the second fire. 3 weeks after the incident, he disappeared. He left no note, took none of his belongings, and simply vanished. His family, who lived in Pittsburgh, received a letter a month later, postmarked from Chicago, in which Henry wrote that he had found work in a meatpacking plant and would not be returning to Pennsylvania. The letter was brief, almost curt, and gave no explanation for his sudden departure. Years later, a journalist investigating the fires at Ironcrest Hall tracked down Henry Doyle in Chicago. By then, he was an old man, living alone in a boarding house on the south side. When asked about his time at Ironcrest Hall, he refused to speak. He said only, "That place is cursed. Whatever happened there, I want no part of it. I left, and I never looked back, and that's all I'll say." The third fire came on November 2, 1913, 5 years after the second. This time, it started in the middle of the night, in the east wing of the second floor, in the private quarters of Cornelius and Evelyn Whitmore. The alarm was raised by Thomas Crane, who had been making his final rounds of the evening and smelled smoke coming from the master bedroom. He pounded on the door, shouting for Cornelius and Evelyn to wake up. When there was no answer, he broke the door down. Inside, the room was filled with smoke. The bed was on fire, the curtains were in flames, and the wallpaper was peeling and blackening in the heat. Thomas found Evelyn unconscious on the floor near the window, her nightgown singed, her face covered in soot. Cornelius was nowhere to be seen. Thomas carried Evelyn out of the room and down the grand staircase, shouting for the other servants to wake up and evacuate. The fire spread quickly, consuming the master bedroom, the adjoining dressing room, and part of the hallway. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the entire second floor was engulfed. It took 6 hours to put out the fire. Evelyn Whitmore was taken to a hospital in Pittsburgh, where she was treated for smoke inhalation and burns. She survived, but she never returned to Ironcrest Hall. After her release from the hospital, she moved into a suite at the Fort Pitt Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh, where she lived alone for the next 4 years until her death in 1917. She never spoke publicly about the fire. She never spoke about Cornelius, because Cornelius Whitmore was dead. His body was found in the ruins of the master bedroom, burned beyond recognition. The coroner determined that he had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached him, but the exact circumstances of his death remained unclear. There was no evidence that he had tried to escape, no indication that he had called for help. It was as if he had simply lain down in his bed and accepted his fate. The investigation into the third fire was the most thorough yet. Fire Chief William Harding, now an old man himself and nearing retirement, examined every inch of the scene. He interviewed every member of the household staff, every guest who had been at Ironcrest Hall in the days before the fire, every tradesman who had done work on the property. He reviewed the reports from the first two fires, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might explain the recurring horror, and he found something. In the charred remains of the master bedroom, buried beneath the debris, Harding discovered a small metal tin. Inside the tin were matches, dozens of them, along with a piece of cloth soaked in what smelled like kerosene. The tin had been hidden beneath the bed, tucked into a space between the floorboards and the box spring. It was clear evidence of arson, but who had put it there? Harding questioned Cornelius's business partners, his rivals, his employees. He looked into the affairs of the household staff, their families, their finances. He examined Evelyn's behavior in the months leading up to the fire, looking for signs of desperation or guilt. But he found nothing conclusive. No one had a clear motive. No one had been seen entering or leaving the master bedroom that night. The case remained unsolved. The official report listed the cause of the third fire as arson by unknown party. Harding recommended that the property be thoroughly investigated for structural defects or deliberate sabotage, but by then, the Whitmore family had no interest in continuing. Cornelius was dead. Evelyn was gone. The house was a ruin. Ironcrest Hall stood empty for 7 years. During that time, it became the subject of intense speculation and rumor. Locals said it was cursed, that the fires were the work of an angry spirit, that the house had been built on stolen land or cursed ground. Others said it was justice, that Cornelius Whitmore had made his fortune on the backs of exploited workers, and that his death was a reckoning. Still others believed that someone in the household, perhaps one of the servants, had been responsible for all 3 fires, enacting a slow and deliberate revenge for years of mistreatment. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated. In 1920, the property was sold to a Pittsburgh real estate developer named Harold Branson, who intended to renovate the house and turn it into a private club for wealthy businessmen. He hired a team of contractors to assess the damage and begin repairs. What they found was disturbing. Hidden in the walls of the servants' quarters, the contractors discovered dozens of letters, notes, and diary entries written by members of the household staff over the years. Some were mundane, detailing daily chores and household gossip, but others were darker, describing abuse, intimidation, and fear. One letter, written by a chambermaid named Eliza Murray in 1902, described being locked in a storage closet for an entire day as punishment for breaking a teacup. Another, written by a scullery maid named Mary Hennigan in 1907, mentioned being struck across the face by Margaret Finch for speaking out of turn. A third, unsigned and undated, simply read, "I cannot endure this any longer. God forgive me for what I am about to do." The contractors also found evidence of structural defects in the house. The wiring, installed during the initial construction, was substandard and poorly insulated, prone to sparking and overheating. The chimneys had been improperly lined, allowing heat and embers to escape into the walls. The fire chief who had investigated the third fire, William Harding, had recommended a full inspection, but it had never been carried out. The house, for all its grandeur, had been a disaster waiting to happen. Harold Branson abandoned his renovation plans. He sold the property in 1923 to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which turned it into a state-run museum. The house was partially restored, the most damaged sections were rebuilt, and the public was invited to tour the estate and learn about the Gilded Age, the steel industry, and the rise and fall of one of Pennsylvania's most notorious families. But the museum curators faced a dilemma. How do you tell the story of Ironcrest Hall without acknowledging the darkness at its heart? How do you celebrate the opulence and ambition of the Gilded Age without confronting the human cost? For years, the official tours focused on the architecture, the art, the lavish lifestyle of the Whitmore family. The fires were mentioned only in passing, described as tragic accidents, with no further explanation. The servants were barely mentioned at all. That changed in 1987, when a graduate student at the University of Pittsburgh named Rebecca Thornton began researching the history of domestic labor in Gilded Age mansions. She spent months in the archives, digging through old newspapers, fire reports, and court records. She tracked down descendants of the household staff, interviewed them, and collected their family stories, and she uncovered a narrative that had been buried for decades. Rebecca's research revealed a pattern of abuse and exploitation at Ironcrest Hall that went far beyond the fires. She found evidence that Cornelius Whitmore had routinely withheld wages, fired servants without cause, and punished minor infractions with cruelty. She found testimonies from former employees describing long hours, dangerous working conditions, and a culture of fear. She found records of servants who had disappeared, like Catherine O'Malley, and whose fates were never investigated. She found letters from Evelyn Whitmore, written in the years after the third fire, in which she expressed guilt and remorse for her silence, for not intervening, for allowing the mistreatment to continue. Rebecca's work was published in 1990 as a book titled Servants of Steel: The Hidden Lives of Ironcrest Hall. It became a bestseller, sparking a national conversation about the darker side of the Gilded Age and the forgotten victims of America's industrial boom. The museum at Ironcrest Hall was forced to revise its tours, incorporating Rebecca's research and acknowledging the suffering of the household staff. A memorial was erected on the property, a simple stone marker inscribed with the names of the servants who had worked and died at Ironcrest Hall, including Catherine O'Malley, whose disappearance had never been solved. And the fires? Rebecca's conclusion, based on her research, was that all three had been acts of deliberate arson, carried out by members of the household staff as acts of resistance and revenge. She could not prove who had set them, but she argued that the pattern, starting with the servants' quarters, then the conservatory, and finally the master bedroom, suggested a progression, a building rage that culminated in the death of Cornelius Whitmore himself. She suggested that the unsigned note found in the walls, "I cannot endure this any longer," was a confession, a final statement from someone who had reached their breaking point. Not everyone agreed with Rebecca's interpretation. Some historians argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the fires could have been accidents after all, that the structural defects in the house were enough to explain the recurring blazes. Others suggested that Cornelius himself might have been responsible, that he had set the fires to collect insurance money or to cover up financial troubles. A few even speculated that Evelyn had been involved, that her withdrawal and strange behavior were signs of guilt, that she had finally taken action against the husband who had imprisoned her in that mansion. The truth, in the end, may never be known. What is clear is that Ironcrest Hall was a place of suffering, a monument not just to wealth and power, but to the human cost of that power. The servants who lived and worked there endured conditions that would be unthinkable today. They were young, poor, desperate, and they had no voice. When they resisted, when they fought back, they did so at great personal risk, and when they disappeared, no one looked for them. Today, Ironcrest Hall is one of the most visited historic sites in Pennsylvania. Tens of thousands of tourists walk through its halls each year, marveling at the architecture, the art, the remnants of a bygone era. The museum offers special tours focused on the servants' quarters, where visitors can see the cramped rooms, the narrow beds, the sparse furnishings. There are exhibits on the three fires, complete with photographs, fire reports, and excerpts from Rebecca Thornton's book. There is a display case containing some of the letters and notes found in the walls, including Catherine O'Malley's final letter to her mother. And in the east wing of the third floor, in the room where Catherine once slept, there is a small plaque. It reads, "In memory of those who served in silence, may their stories never be forgotten." But even now, more than a century after the fires, questions remain. What really happened to Catherine O'Malley? Who set the fires, and why? Was Cornelius Whitmore's death an accident, or was it murder? And what role did Evelyn play in the tragedy that unfolded within those walls? Some say the house is haunted. Visitors and staff have reported strange occurrences over the years. Doors that open and close on their own, footsteps in empty hallways, the smell of smoke where there is no fire. The security guards who work the night shift refuse to patrol the third floor alone. They say they feel watched, that the air grows cold, that they hear whispers in the darkness. But perhaps the real ghosts of Ironcrest Hall are not supernatural. Perhaps they are the memories of those who suffered there, the invisible men and women whose labor built the Gilded Age and whose stories were buried along with their bones. Perhaps the curse of Ironcrest Hall is not a curse at all, but a reckoning, a reminder that wealth and power have always come at a cost, and that cost is borne by those with the least power to resist Cornelius Ashford. Whitmore built Ironcrest Hall to be his legacy, a monument to his success, a statement of permanence. But legacies are complicated things. They are not just the mansions and the fortunes and the portraits hanging on the walls. They are also the scars, the injustices, the lives broken in the pursuit of greatness. Ironcrest Hall is both a palace and a prison, a testament to ambition and a reminder of its price. And the fires? Perhaps they were the inevitable result of that contradiction, the moment when the pressure became too great, when the silence could no longer be maintained, when the hidden cost of the Gilded Age finally burst into flame today. As you walk through the halls of Ironcrest Hall, past the marble staircase and the gilded ballroom and the conservatory that was rebuilt from ash, remember this. Behind every grand mansion is a hidden world, a world of labor and sacrifice and suffering. Behind every fortune is a human cost, and behind every story of success is a story of those who were left behind. Ironcrest Hall was shaped by fear and fortune. Power ended there, and darkness began. But the darkness was not supernatural. It was the darkness of exploitation, of inequality, of a system that valued profit over people, and that darkness, in one form or another, still exists today. The question is, what will we do about it? If you found this investigation as haunting as we did, make sure you're subscribed to Empire Manners. We bring you the untold stories behind America's most infamous estates, the secrets hidden in the walls, the lives forgotten by history. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell, because there are more dark stories waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss them. Thank you for watching, and remember, every mansion has a story. Not all of them are beautiful.